Hi everyone, it's Darlene. Welcome back for another card video. I have a fun root beer float card for you. I used some puffy ink for the whipped cream, and I'll show you that in just a second. So here is the stamp that I'm using. It's called Mixed Drinks. I'm using this root beer float cup. It's actually, I think, probably a beer, but I'm using it as root beer. And I have this fluff background stamp by Impression Obsession. I love it. It's got so many different uses. And then here is the puffy ink. It's Radiant Neon Amplify in white. It's made by Sukaneko, and you heat it to puff it up. I'm going to start by stamping my mug onto some Neenah Solar White cardstock using some Memento Tuxedo Black ink. And then I'm going to color it with some Copic markers. I have C4, which is kind of a darker gray, and C1, which is a light gray. And I'm just kind of coloring in the shadow areas of the mug edge. And then I'll fill it in with the C1. So I'm not doing too much here, just getting some color down so that you can see it's a mug. And I'm also going to flick upward from the bottom, and that's going to sort of add some additional dimension to the cup. I'm going to use these same colors to create a tabletop. I'm starting with the dark, and I'm just drawing a line to the left and to the right. And then I'm going to color in just a little bit on the left and on the right and make it a little thick, but I'm going to leave that area about half to 2/3 of the way blank for my C1, and then I just filled in the rest with some C1. And now I'm going to introduce some 0, and all I'm going to do here is color the edge. I'm just going to soften it so I don't see a lot of marker lines. I decided to let that dry a little bit before I colored my root beer so that the colors wouldn't run together. And so I'm stamping my straw in some real red ink. And now I'm starting with the root beer. So I'm going to flick upward just because it's the easiest thing to do. So I'm going to start with the dark, and I start at the bottom every time, and I flick my pen upward. And you can tell I'm not going over those 2 gray lines that I drew at the beginning. Now I'm taking my E43, and I'm going to cover a little bit over the E44 and blend it upward with the same flicking motion. And then with the E40, I started at the top because it was easier. I flipped it around, and then I flicked upward again. And I decided I wanted a little bit darker in the middle, so I went back in with my E43, and I'm just coloring that in a little bit darker. And then I'll flip it over and blend that back together with the E40. And then just for a little bit of additional dimension, I added a little bit more of the E44 at the bottom. That completes my root beer, so now I'm going to start working on my whipped cream. I did a couple of tests here. I put some of the puffy ink on some cardstock. I let the left hand sample dry first before I heated it, and the right one I heated when it was still wet. And you can see you get a much smoother look when you let it dry first. So I'm going to go ahead and do that on this card, and you'll see what happens. I made an interesting finding. When you squeeze the bottle, it actually comes out pretty quickly, so you have to be a little careful. I'm applying it inside the ink lines, and I did notice that some bubbles came out, but the bottle does say shake vigorously before you apply it, which I did. So you just have to be a little bit careful and precise when you're putting it on your cardstock. So I'm going to cover this whole thing, and I'm going to let it dry, and we'll come back to this later. In the meantime, I'm going to work on my background. So this is called Fluff, and I love it because you can use it with so many different things. It looks like wind, it looks like snow, it looks like fire. It's just such a great versatile stamp to use for a background, and it's subtle. I'm going to use clear, this is Versamark ink. You could leave it with just the Versamark and you get a nice subtle tone-on-tone look, but I wanted it to be a little bit darker, so I'm going to sprinkle it with some clear embossing powder and heat it to set it. I'm going to set my mug behind this panel, so I'm going to cut it using the largest Simon Says Stamp stitched circle. I'm just going to place it kind of toward the top of my cardstock and run it through my Big Shot. Next, I'm going to work on my sentiment. This sentiment comes with the Mixed Drinks stamp set, and I'm going to ink it up with some Memento Tuxedo Black ink and stamp it in the center of some cardstock, and I'm going to trim it out. And I wasn't sure exactly how much red I wanted to use, so I just kind of eyeballed it and trimmed it out with my trimmer, and then I adhered it with some ATG tape runner. And this is to match the straw, so I could bring in a little bit more red. Now that this is dry, you can see it's a little bit glossy. It's still flat, nothing's happened because I haven't heated it. But one thing I noticed is I could still see stamp lines inside behind it. And I wasn't sure how that was going to affect when it puffed up. So I decided to go ahead and move forward, and I'm going to heat this. And I suppose because it's dry, it took longer to heat than when it was wet. I guess because I had to reactivate things and melt it, and it took a little bit longer. And so as a result of that, my paper got a little bit more warped than it did when I heated it when it was wet, the first version I did of this card. So after I did that, I could still see the stamp lines. I'd kind of melted into the white paint. I'm going to take care of that in a little bit. So now I'm going to just trim out that back panel so it doesn't show through my crumb cake. And then I'll adhere my sentiment to the crumb cake with some ATG tape runner. I'll just trim off the edges there. And then I'm going to put Scotch foam tape on the entire back of this panel so it'll pop up over the mug. And then I'll just center the mug right there in the circle. And then I'm going to adhere this to my card base, which is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 Neenah Solar White. And I had a little bit showing on the right hand side. I guess my crumb cake was off, so I just cut that off with a scissor. So I'm going to hold this up to the camera. I don't know if you can see the memento line showing through, but it did bother me a little bit. So what I decided to do was take some more of that white ink and just go over the whole thing again with a very, very thin layer because I don't want it to be too puffy. And then while it's still wet, I'm going to heat it to set it. And it set very quickly. It puffed up and set really quickly because it was wet. And it did cover up pretty much the memento that had melted in. And this is water-based pigment, so that's why the memento kind of melted into it. You can see I'm trying to unwarp it a little bit because when I heated it that second time, I heated it while the card was closed, which then warped the back. So anyway, a lot of warping issues, but what I ended up doing is spraying the back with a little bit of water and putting some weight on it, and that definitely flattened it out a little bit. But anyway, I really do like this puffy stuff, and I would recommend it maybe for this Christmas to use on snow and things like that. So anyway, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.